This century is going to be defined by the relationship between the United States and China. We've said we've pivoted to the Pacific for more than a decade, and in actual behavior and actions, that's not accurate.
Charles Flynn is the recently retired four-star Army general who served as the commanding general of the United States Army Pacific from 2021 to 2024.
This A2AD arsenal is primarily designed to defeat the strengths of the United States military. And the strengths are our air power and our maritime power, primarily. Secondarily, it's designed to degrade, deny, and disrupt our capabilities in space and cyber. It will take time for them to actually move from their garrisons to the coast, load those vessels, and get across. What keeps me up at night is their ability to actually pull that off in 96 hours.
In this wide-ranging interview, we dive into U.S. security strategy in the Indo-Pacific. What are the best ways to deter the Chinese Communist regime and its malign tactics in the region and protect Taiwan?
We don't have the luxury of being able to be everywhere, and when you're everywhere, you're nowhere. So here's the playbook.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. General Charles Flynn, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thanks. I appreciate you having me, and very grateful to Epoch Times for the opportunity.
So let's talk about this headline from the Indo-Pacific. Okay, Japan threatening us militarily. China tells German foreign minister. That's Reuters. What's your reaction?
Well, I look at the two recent incidents of the rhetoric going back and forth between China and Japan, and then just 48 hours ago, aircraft from China basically locking radars on Japanese jets. I think Japan is beginning to take seriously the threats that China has imposed upon them and the penetrations of their air exclusion zone, maritime exclusion zone. And so it's important that Japan step up and take these actions to protect their own people and their own national sovereignty, but also signal to the United States through our treaty and through our alliance that they're not going to put up with this kind of behavior, irresponsible behavior by the Chinese.
How important, from the military perspective, is China for the United States?
It is the most important. I think by way of threats, it poses the most dangerous one to the United States. I'll start back a little bit. In 2012, President Xi obviously took over the presidency of the Communist Chinese Party. And again, I'm going to say this right up front. I'm not against the Chinese people, but I am against the Communist Chinese Party. If you just jump forward to about the 2014, 2015 timeframe, what was happening was their economy was moving at a pace that was unprecedented. Their modernization efforts had caught up with their training reformations and some of their reorganizations of their military formations. So here we are in 2025. So that's a decade ago. And as I've said publicly before, if we don't slow their trajectory down, that is a very, very dangerous outcome for the United States and arguably for the globe.
And they, of course, say, well, we're just doing this to protect ourselves.
Well, maybe so. On the other hand, I think that the arsenal that they've created, the A2AD arsenal that they've created, which is, got a serious amount of reach in all of their forces, from hypersonics.
And maybe just explain what that is. Yeah.
This A2AD arsenal, which is anti-access area denial force, is primarily designed to defeat the strengths of the United States military. And the strengths are our air power and our maritime power, primarily. Secondarily, it's designed to degrade, deny, and disrupt our capabilities in space and cyber. Okay? One thing it is not designed to do, it's not designed to find, fix, and finish distributed, mobile, reloadable, and networked land forces inside the Indo-Pacific. Okay? And the land force network and the land power network that I'm talking about is built around the United States Army, the United States Marine Corps, the United States Special Operations Forces, and then the fourth component, which is a really important component, which is the land forces inside of Asia. So when I look at the map, I see people, I see terrain, I see borders, and I see sovereignty. When others look at the map, and traditionally I think this has been part of our challenge in the United States, we look at the map and we see blue. We see an ocean and we see air, and we say, well, we can solve this problem with, more ships, more subs, more airplanes, more jets, more precision guided munitions, more satellites. Look, I'm not against a large U.S. Navy and a large U.S. Air Force and all the other capabilities that have to come with things, platforms. In fact, we need them. Why? Because they do only what the United States can do, which is keep the global commons open. What I'm saying is that region is a joint and it's a multinational problem. It's a joint and multinational theater, and it can only be solved by joint and multinational applications in all domains. That includes the land forces. The predominant force in Asia is its armies. I'll go through a couple of facts. India, 80% of its military is its army. Indonesia, 75%. Thailand, 75%. Vietnam, 80%. Heck, the Philippines, 70% of its military is its army, has more divisions than the U.S. Army does. And I could go on and on. The point I'm making is there's a natural partnering and a persistent state of connection between land forces in the region, and we cannot discount those forces in the region that are land-based. That what do? They protect their territorial integrity and they defend their national sovereignty. And some of those forces are beginning to step up in ways that we never saw before. And that's one of the things I'm very proud of my time, over the last 10 years out in the region is really trying to tie together a strategic land power network as a counterweight to what the Chinese are doing. I'll go on a little bit here and also say that some experts, and I'll leave that open, is they often refer to the Chinese Navy as its center of gravity. And I say, no, it's not its center of gravity. Why? Because the military definition is that which you need in order to achieve your objective, okay? My view is you can't invade Taiwan with the Chinese Navy and the Chinese Air Force. You actually have to deliver an invasion force, and that is its Chinese army. That's the PLA, okay, of which there are many of them. And my point is that we have a way of increasing the indications and warnings to our National Command Authority by watching the Army. Why? Because the Army, it actually has to mobilize, move, combat configure, combat load, and then get across the Taiwan Strait in order to seize, hold, and subjugate the people of Taiwan. Now, the last time we did something like that successfully was the Incheon landing. It is a highly, highly complex operation. And the point I'm making here is the naval incursions and the air incursions are happening every day at alarming rates. And that keeps the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy really engaged every day, not to mention Japanese, Korean, and of course Taiwan and others. But my point here is that if we get command and control, we get intelligence collection forward, along with sustainment, along with protection, and we tie together the synergy between the forces in the region on the land, then we can impose dilemmas on the Chinese that heretofore we've not put on them. If you want to understand if they're going to mobilize that PLA army, then you've got to watch the PLA army, because it will take time for them to actually move from their garrisons to the coast, load those vessels, and get across. You're not going to see and have that kind of time with air power and naval power from the Chinese. There'll be some indicators, but when they start moving that army, then there's a problem. Things need to stop very quickly. So what keeps me up at night? What keeps me up at night is their ability to actually pull that off in 96 hours. That's what keeps me up at night. So anything that we can do to slow down that timeline, feed doubt, sow paranoia, and introduce new dilemmas to the Chinese leadership, then we are on a stronger footing by way of deterrence and denying them the ability to think that they could pull that off.
General Flynn, we're going to take a quick break right now, and folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with the former commander of the U.S. Army Pacific, General Charles Flynn. It sounds like you're saying that the U.S. should put more military assets in these countries in partnership with those militaries. And that's been described even by some people that are, let's say friendly to this administration and so forth, as being almost like intervention, or could even be like an occupying force, or some sort of nation building, or perhaps empire even. How do you respond to that kind of criticism, that this would be somehow away from an America First vision, what you're describing?
I actually think it's part of that, but I'll say it a different way. So first of all, and again, to remind folks, like America's day starts in the second island chain. Those are U.S. Citizens, and that is part of our defensive perimeter all the way out to Guam and the Northern Marianas, the Marshall Islands, and CNMI. So we already are a Pacific nation. We have 4 of our 5 treaty allies out there: Korea, Japan, Australia, and Thailand. So, and obviously, I say that this century is going to be defined by the relationship between the United States and China, like last century was defined by the relationship between the United States and Europe. We already have a sizable U.S. military in Korea and Japan. I'm not looking to do more bases. What I'm really looking to do is have more faces in more places with less bases, okay? So what that means is dynamic, rotational, and an increase in multinational and joint exercises that are out in the region. Look, when I was in uniform as the U.S. Army commander in the Pacific, we had over 40 Army-to-Army and joint exercises that the Army alone had in the region. So my point is, we need to be in those regions and in those areas and in those countries to increase the confidence of those partners and allies in the region that the United States will help them defend what they need to do. But I also take a look at the national security strategy, and I think about the remarks of Secretary Hegseth at Reagan, and I'll sum up, I think, the foreign policy of that strategy as this administration is going to help those that help themselves. It's also, said another way, I would say that in order to have some say, they're going to want you to pay. They're going to want you to put some money on the table. Why? Because it's an investment in your own defense, in protecting your own territorial integrity and national sovereignty. And a large part of their security umbrella in the region are their land forces, just like China. China's army and the people's police force is enormous. So, I think that we are downplaying in sort of a high-risk way the role of land forces in the region. And I've had these conversations with a number of people. I've been saying it for at least 4 or 5 years as a 4-star and retired 4-star, but I really was talking about it even as a 3-star and a 2-star in my time out there. And I just think that, we're 10 years from that window of modernization, organizational change, and the technology injects into the military in China. And I think that we cannot wait anymore. We cannot wait. I mean, speed is our biggest problem right now. We have to have a greater sense of urgency to counter what the Chinese are doing in the region. I'll remind folks that their goal is regional hegemony and then global dominance, okay? So that's stated plainly by their leaders. So if they can gain that regional hegemony, that gives them a step to their global aspirations. We have to prevent that regional hegemony from going on. Now, I am for, I think Secretary Bessent has said, we don't want to decouple, we want to de-risk. I understand that. But I think we need to look at the certain sectors to say, well, how much risk is in, say, the critical mineral and rare earth element area? Very, very high risk. How much risk is in the pharmaceutical sector? A significant amount of risk. So I guess within those sectors, we're going to have to decide which ones are we going to actually go further in de-risking and maybe even delinking, our connection to China. We didn't have this problem with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This is a problem primarily that's been created by our policies towards them since their entry into the WTO. And that free trade nation status allowed them to be woven into all the regions across the globe and into every sector, and they deliberately made decisions to check us or box us or prevent us in certain sectors, and now look at the position that we find ourselves in. It's very dangerous.
Well, so and this all has been part of their unrestricted warfare strategy. This has been, you could call it military strategy, you could call it industrial policy. From their perspective, these are all kind of interlinked, interwoven things, right? But somehow it's been very hard for us to notice, and I don't even know, is the U.S. military able to recognize all of that activity as military activity? Yeah.
Well, what I would say is I think the military has recognized it, but let me give a couple of points here. First of all, sometimes we need an event, and I'll just draw a historical analogy because it's the 9th of December. The Second World War did not start on the 7th of December, 1941. It actually started in 1931, 10 years prior, with the Japanese invading Manchuria. And then you have Spanish Civil War in Europe, you have the Italians in Ethiopia. There were a series of regional wars that were going on across the globe. It was world wars too, not just one war. And then if you go forward to like 37 through 39, the things that were happening in Europe, in your own home country, what was happening when the Japanese then went into Southeast Asia. December 7th, 1941 was the end of a decade of regional wars that had exploded into now what was a world war. Well, where do we find ourselves today? We've got a regional war going on in Europe with Ukraine and Russia, and NATO is, tangled up in it. We've got the Israeli-Iran, Gaza war going on across the Middle East. You could argue there are other spots of war going on in Africa and even Southeast Asia. And so the last thing that we actually need is another regional war in the Indo-Pacific, because in my view, that's a global war. That would be akin to what I just outlined from 1931 to 1941. And look what that rendered. 85 million people by some estimates were killed. Okay. So if I just take the clock back on my own watch, because I went back out there in my second assignment in 2014 as a 2-star division commander, and then I was a 2-star deputy commander in U.S. Army Pacific. And I think about what was going on during that period of time. This is why I say that China has been on an incremental, insidious, and irresponsible path to create conditions where they gain regional hegemony because they have global aspirations. And so, yes, they have been conducting war. I'm going to say that primarily this has been going on in the information domain and in the legal domain. Okay.
What about financial?
Okay. I mean,
right, you're including that in the trade, I guess.
I am, and in the previous, question, we talked about those sectors that they had gone in and dominated. Now look, we find ourselves with 90% of the processing of rare earth elements and critical minerals has been done by China. I'm going to give you a couple of stories of 2 countries that I won't name, but both of them are in Southeast Asia. So here's the playbook. China buys land. They buy those land near locations where we primarily train at. They own, 90% of a telecommunications company. They put towers on the land. So you automatically know what they're doing with those towers nearby, proximity-wise, to where we train at. Then they own large parts of media companies, and then they build bot farms to spew misinformation, disinformation about the West and about the United States. This is happening throughout the Indo-Pacific. It's happening all over Asia. I would argue it's happening all across the globe, to include inside of our own country. We have to wake up, we have to get a sense of urgency, and we have to come up with a strategy and a plan to counter what they've been doing.
How much do you think that this national security strategy that we just saw drop, How much do you think that addresses exactly what you talked about?
I think it squarely addresses almost all of it. Now, I know there's a debate out there about, well, the Western Hemisphere is first. Well, I mean, I think that our homeland has always been, at least from military terms, is defend the homeland first. You have to protect, your families, your freedoms, your independence, our prosperity. But and then after that, it's China as an adversary. Now, what I would say is I think the best defense is a forward defense. We've said we've pivoted to the Pacific for more than a decade. And in actual behavior and actions, that's not accurate. I'm going to give you an example and a story. So in April of 2022, I was in a ASEAN country, and I was at a meeting with the Chief of Defense, the Chief of Army, and their Minister of Defense. And an announcement had been made that evening that a $33 billion support package was going to Ukraine because the war had just started in February of 22. And the Chief of Army and the Chief of Defense stood there with me next to the Minister of Defense, and they asked me this question. They really made a comment to me, and they said, "Are you serious? $33 billion to Ukraine? You've been talking about pivoting to the Pacific for more than a decade. What is going to happen now? Are you going to be here?" I honestly believe the greatest counterweight that we have to China is the network of allies and partners that we have across the region. We need to maintain the United States being the security partner of choice, even though China may be the economic partner of necessity in the region. And I think the best way to keep that security architecture bound together is by applying all domain, all forces, joint and multinational in the region. And that includes the land power network that is actually central to maintaining security in the region. And again, I'm making this point because I run afoul or at odds sometimes when I hear, well, I mean, just this morning before I came over here, I hear the theater is an air and maritime theater, and it's not. It's a joint theater. It's a multinational theater. It's got joint and multinational problems. It's only going to be solved by the joint force and multinational forces.
Well, General Flynn, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation for me. A final thought as we finish?
Well, thanks for the opportunity to share my thoughts here with you. I think that your style and the Epoch Times focus on China and national security events here has been very, very helpful, and I just appreciate you asking to sit down and talk with me for a little bit. I hope in some ways my views are helpful for both you and your audience. So thank you.
Thank you all for joining General Charles Flynn and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.